In the last couple of weeks, the international strategic situation has dramatically changed. A couple weeks ago, Helga Zepp-LaRouche said that we're in a period which is reminiscent of August of 1989, the months preceding the fall of the Berlin Wall. And what you have now is a situation which is so tense, on the brink of thermonuclear war, and most Americans are not even aware of what is going on. What has occurred is that President Obama has picked up the leftover policy of the Bush-Cheney administration to encircle Russia in Eastern Europe with a series of anti-ballistic missile defense systems. If these systems were to actually work, and there's reason to believe that they would not, but supposing they did, we could then knock out the Russian missile system within 3 minutes, which completely offsets the deterrence and international stability. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Russia, Makarov, said at a security conference in Moscow last week that this is absolutely unacceptable, that if NATO goes ahead with this proposal, and NATO so far has refused even to issue a written statement confirming that these systems are not directed at Russia, so that if NATO and the United States go ahead and build these installations in Eastern Europe, Russia will be forced to launch preemptive strikes and knock out these systems. This is not a bluff. The American media is trying to make light of this and say that the Russians are bluffing, but if you imagine the situation in reverse, if the Russians were to establish a series of anti-ballistic missile defense systems in Mexico and tell us that this was not aimed at the United States and it could wipe out all of our military bases in a matter of minutes, do you think the United States would allow that? Obviously not. So we have put the Russians in a situation where they will be forced to respond unless Obama is removed from office or can be made to come to his senses, which at this point is unlikely. Obama is saying that he will possibly change his position after the November elections. The NATO summit where this is being decided occurs May 20th. That's 2 weeks from now. So we are in a countdown of literally days to a possible thermonuclear confrontation with Russia, possible preemptive strikes on our installations in Eastern Europe if we choose to go ahead with this insane policy. Now, in that context, the Russian news media has begun to publish a series of very lengthy articles on the American statesman and economist Lyndon LaRouche. And the Russian editor was just interviewed and asked about this, and he said, well, it's interesting, the intellectuals of Russia are very interested in discussing LaRouche's views, particularly his views on the British Empire, whereas in the United States, the intellectual community is terribly controlled, almost as if under a dictatorial regime where people try to brush off LaRouche's warnings saying he's a conspiracy theorist, and that way they feel that they don't have to discuss them at all. Now, the American population feels differently, and what's been seen in the last round of primary elections is that, first of all, President Obama was nearly defeated in the West Virginia primaries by a convicted felon who got 40% of the votes sitting in prison and actually won delegates to the convention from that state. In North Carolina, Obama got something like 80% of the vote. He was the only person on the ballot. 20% of the population voted for uncommitted. Then you have the situation of Walter Jones, the U.S. congressman who introduced H.C.R. 107, a resolution stating that any president who who launches a war without the consent of the Congress has committed an impeachable offense. In spite of attempts to sabotage the re-election of this congressman, he was overwhelmingly re-elected. He won his primary with about 70% of the vote. So the American people are clearly waking up. On the Democratic side, you also have a similar revolt brewing in the Senate, where Senator Jim Webb has introduced a bill saying that in the case of this President Obama, he will have to seek congressional authorization to launch so-called humanitarian missions because Obama claimed that bombing Libya was a humanitarian mission and therefore did not need the consent of the Congress, when what he actually was doing was committing an impeachable offense. So what you see is a very dramatic situation of extremes. On the one hand, we are facing potentially a thermonuclear showdown with Russia. On the other hand, what you see is a revolt in the United States and in Europe, where Greece now cannot even form a government. 11 banks in Spain have been downgraded by Moody's. And here in the United States, Rutgers University has just released a study saying that 85% of college graduates are being forced to move back in with their parents. So you can see nobody believes the lie that we are in an economic recovery. We're not. What we are at the beginning of, potentially, is a second American revolution, a revolution of the mind, where the American people can rise above their petty pragmatism and popular opinion, reject the policies of the British monetarist system of the last 30 years, and reinstate the Glass-Steagall Act, restore the American system of banking as the LaRouche slate has been proposing, and launch massive projects of real economic development, such as NWAPA, which will transform the face of the planet. That's the choice before us, and that's what the population has to do now.